Good afternoon. My name is Gabriel Barta. I work for the International Electrotechnical Commission. And in case you haven't heard of us, it will come out a little bit in my very short talk. Thank you. My role here is not directly nuclear. It is to contribute one aspect of the problem that has to be solved for nuclear as for coal or oil-fired, which is the baseload problem, and the grid requirements for renewables, which, as we heard in the introductions, are one of the big development aspects. Next slide, please. Thank you very much. So the problem is baseload generation, or rather the problem isn't baseload generation. The problem is renewables introduced into the grid, and we have that problem already in one or two places, and the plans that many governments have told us they're making will produce that problem in a large number of grids where it doesn't exist today. Renewables, as we already heard very briefly, are inconstant. They're unpredictable, or even when predictable, they aren't predictable at the same level. They're predictable to drop if it's solar, whether it's photovoltaic or thermal. If it's solar directly, then they will drop at night. We know that.
No, not true. Not true.
It isn't true in all parts of the world. It's true in any one part.
Mm-hmm. The storage. Sorry.
Yeah. The storage comes. Don't be impatient. However, the grid must stay stable, and it must satisfy the needs for electricity. So we're talking about electricity generation, mainly. There are many other aspects, and renewable energies are not only a generation issue, but let's talk about that in this brief session. So it's a challenge for base loads, because if the wind blows too hard, the grid will collapse because there's too much. If the base load keeps on going and there's more wind than to complete the amount that's needed, the grid cannot take the extra electricity. Not everyone knows that. I'm not an electrical engineer, so you can correct me, those of you who are experts. But if you've got too much from the wind turbine, it won't take it. So either you throw it away or you've got a big problem. But of course, the other side is even worse. When the baseload isn't enough to satisfy demand, you have to do something. In other words, you've planned for a baseload and for some renewable, and then the renewable falls short. You have to do something. And what is done today is what are called complementary sources, which are oil-fired or diesel, or you raise the output of certain baseload plants, which also is inefficient, just like oil-fired and diesel. The kind that you switch on and that are very fast to react, which you need, are not efficient. You have the problem that these, of course, pollute much more than the ones which you can control. And so renewables not only solve problems, that is CO2 emission, but they also create them. So that is the fundamental problem that I'm addressing very briefly. Next slide, please. So why am I saying this? Who's the IEC, and why should we believe this character who's in front of a large room full of expert people who is talking to them? And the reason is that the IEC produces international standards, and moreover, it does it using a process which we think is promising for this big challenge. And that is that we write only technical documents and not political ones, A. B, we write technical specifications which are voluntary. Now, why is that significant? Because that gets round or around or over a number of resistance phenomena that we've seen in recent years, where people tell the other people, don't teach us how to do our job, and they say, clean up your house first before you start talking to us. One approach to trying to solve this problem is to have the technical basis agreed to start with, and that's where we come in. That's where we can do things. Our international standards involve all stakeholders, not only governments, but not only private companies which are out for profit. The two are balanced, and they're balanced by researchers and technologists who try to make sure that we have the best technical documents which can be produced. And we're country-based. We're international, and 163 countries out of the UN membership of 190-odd are involved with the IEC. So we have a certain basis, which includes, of course, the developing world and the emerging economies. Next slide, please. So why should standards be able to help? The challenge can only be met by international agreement. I talked about resistance. There are all sorts of other reasons why a big economy, or even three big economies doing it, are enough, and the other 190 UN members can do whatever they like, it won't make a difference. In this case, that's not true. That's not true. We need international agreement, and we need it for more than just the political resistance. And it needs clear technical specifications. If we don't have the technical job right, anyone can stand up who has a good engineering experience and say, but you're talking nonsense. Don't do it that way. It won't work. We found that the way that we and ISO and ITU, the three international standards organizations, the way that we develop our standards is probably the best worldwide technical consensus that we can achieve. It's not always very good, but we don't know of a better one. And so if regulations and policy are needed to solve our problems, and we hear that from many people, including our introduction, then it's best if they're based on solid technical foundations which have already been agreed by everybody involved. Next slide, please. So the possible solutions from the IEC are things like energy efficiency, load shifting, or sometimes called time shifting, that is, reorganizing one's use of electricity so it's used at times of the day but also of the year when there is more available. The storage of surplus power, and that's a big thing, and that is what Professor Rubia just told us about, and it can't be done without it. I promise you, without electricity storage, even for months at a time, we can't solve the problem. And storage also not only swallows the extra power you've got without letting it go to waste when there is too much, but also it supplies you power when there's too little. Next slide, please. So we've published 2 papers in the last 2 years. Actually, the second one isn't quite published. It's this coming month, but we're doing it. There's one that shows how we believe the energy efficiency and CO2 emission problem in general should be attacked, and where standards can help, but also where, from the standards perspective, we believe that, as you can see at the bottom of the slide, regulators and companies, big multinational companies which have enormous influence, and we are glad that they do in many ways, where they can actually use standards to fulfill their part of the job. And I mustn't omit to say that conformity assessment to standard, that is, testing and certifying or declaring that what you have just done is conformant to international standards, is an absolutely fundamental part of it. It's not enough to have the technical specification. You also have to have confidence that what the producer or the installation company has just delivered to you actually lives up to its billing. Next slide, please. And the second paper, which we're going to publish next month, this is a preliminary copy, so I won't give it to you, is on electrical energy storage. And what we've done is to survey what the needs are for storage. And the needs that we've identified, the really big needs, are load shifting and storing it when you've got too much. That is, short-term storage will allow you to behave to the rest of the grid as though you needed the electricity at the right moment when it's available, even though actually you need it at some other time of the day, for example. And then long-term storage is absolutely essential to be able to fulfill the functions over longer than a day or at most a week. We surveyed the technologies, and I won't bore you with that, but they're in here. And we only went into detail, well, not much detail at that, on the ones that are directly relevant to the market in our judgment over the next 20 years or so. And then our conclusions, there are 3 technologies, and in particular we make recommendations about how these 3 technologies should be developed and who should be doing it. And it's not just researchers, because they develop new stuff, right? It's also obviously government, it's regulations, it's also the companies which choose where to put their research and their effort because they see a return. And so that's what we can contribute, and that is, I believe, one of the necessary accompaniments to nuclear energy and the other base loads in the coming world, because even if we manage to increase nuclear, renewables will also increase, and the stability of the grid may suffer from that. Do I have anything more? Thank you for your attention.